Magandang hapon mga kaibigan, and welcome to this session. And in today's session, I would like to talk about the assigned reading that I gave to you entitled Globalization and Media, Creating the Global Village by Jack Lole. And uh, and that the article was divided into different topics. The first one is they were trying to define globalization and the media etymology. Okay, so they try to give different definitions of um, globalization. And I think we will not go into that because we have already discussed many times. And I think, in fact, several times, we have been discussing about the meaning of globalization. Okay. But I would like to touch on one topic, which is about the history of globalization. And some people say, kailan ba talaga nagsimula ang globalization ito? And in fact, many scholars are divided into different opinions. So they said that it began a few decades ago, while they say it began in the late 1900s when advances in media and transportation technology truly globalized the world. One of the global cultural anthropologists, Arjun Apudarai, feels that there was a rupture within the social life in the 20th century. And he says that the advances in the media, such as the television, computers, and cell phones, combined with the changes in the migration patterns, such as people more easily flowing back and forth around the world, and those two diacritics, the media and migration, fundamentally changed human life. And Apudarai says and gave rise to this entity that we call now globalization. So there are also scholars who believe that globalization started from the very beginning. So para sa kanila, naniniwala sila na nang magsimula ang mga tao na mag-appear sa mundo, ay nagsimula na silang mag-globalize. Although there were the differences is that in the momentum, because there are many contributors or factors that contributes to the process of globalization. And sabi nga sa panahon natin, sinasabi nila na during the late 19th century, late 19th century, ito daw yung tinatawag natin na golden age of globalization. And this was prior to the First World War and the Second World War. So bago nagkaroon ng unang digmaan na pangdaigdigan, yun ang panahon na tinatawag nila the golden age of globalization, sapagkat sa panahon na yon ay naging tahimik ang mundo, and everyone was engaged in business, and everyone was transacting, and the world was going on its job, and little by little they were integrating their economy. So ito ang tinatawag na the golden age of globalization. Kaya lang, nang matapos ang First World War at saka Second World War, para nagkaroon ng tinatawag na nagkaroon ng parang gap yung proseso ng globalization, nag-slow down siya because some countries became they became protectionist. Naging silang mga protectionist itong mga countries nito. Probably because of the experience brought about by the First and the Second World War, they were trying to be protectionist. So anong ibig sabihin ng protectionist? So in order for us to understand the meaning of protectionist, let us put it into the juxtaposition or the opposite position of globalization. Yan, protectionism or open borders. Kasi pag open borders, ibig sabihin, there is less control in the tariffs and trade. Meaning to say, people are liberal with, countries are liberal with the tariffs and trades. Kasi yung tariff, ibig sabihin, yung buwis na ini-impose ng mga countries doon sa mga imported products, yun ang nagsiserve na not only as the means of the income of the country, but also as a means of control. Kasi kung gusto ng isang bansa kontrolin ang pagpasok ng mga produkto sa kanilang bansa, ang ginagawa nila ay dinadagdagan yung buwis, pinapamahal yung produkto para ma-discourage yung mga producers na mag-export doon sa kanila ng produktong yun. And there are also times when countries impose strict regulations, especially like, for example, not only in the production or the importation of goods, but also in the importations of services. Like, for example, halimbawa, Japan is an example of a protectionist country. There were several instances when Japan has been a protectionist, especially when it comes to the practice of the profession. So, ibig sabihin, hindi ka gaanong makakapasok doon kapag ikaw ay hindi ka basta-basta makakapasok sa Japan na mag-practice ka ng profession ninyo. Kaya nga minsan ang mga bilihin sa Japan ay mahal. Mahal ang mga bigas, mahirap din mag-practice ng iba-ibang profession sa Japan kasi nga marami silang regulations na ini-impose. Ngayon, ang purpose nila is to protect their own industry so that their own industry will not be subjected to competition from other goods and services coming from other country. Yan. So yan ang kasaysayan ng globalization. At sa panahon natin ngayon, ito ng pag-open ng mga borders ay patuloy itong inaadhika ng mga especially ng mga developed countries, because this will be advantageous to them if countries are open with their borders. So magiging borderless sila because with that they'll be able to move their products around, and at the same time they will also be able to obtain raw materials. So yan ang ibig sabihin ng kasaysayan ng globalization. So ang globalization ay mayroon din siyang kasaysayan. It begins from the very beginning. And now, let us come to the most important topic related to globalization, which is mass media. Ngayon, ang katanungan, posible ba? Is it possible to have globalization without the media? But before we answer that question, let us first define what is the media. The word media, the plural for medium, meaning to say medium, ibig sabihin, instrument or channel of communication. Ngayon, what the things that connect human beings in the world, the thing that connects human being from the personal dimension and even into the communal and national and international dimension is communication. And we communicate in many ways. And the most primary means of communication method that we have is the spoken language. We have all of us speak in our language, and the language that we speak is actually the medium. Yun ang medium. Sabi nga yan ang pinakaunang uri ng medium na develop ng mga tao, yung pagsasalita. 'Di ba? Communication. So alimbawa, sa mga lugar na malalayo, for example, during the primitive period, how did the American Indians communicated with each other? They were using sounds, 'di ba? They were using sounds with their mouth. So it's kind of a language that they speak. Yan. So even sa panahon natin ngayon, with the advanced means of media, ay very basic pa rin sa atin ang paggamit ng language. That's why sabi nga dito, if we will take into consideration the evolution of media and globalization, the very first form of medium is the oral communication. So speech is often the most overlooked medium in history of globalization. Yet the oral medium or the human speech is the oldest and most enduring of all media. Kaya nga noong unang panahon baga, there's no means of wala pang printed word, wala pang printing noon. Wala pang means of recording stories. Kaya nauso noon yung tinatawag na storyteller. Kaya yung mga tribo, meron silang mga tinatawag na mga storytellers. Ang work ng mga storytellers na ito ay i-convey doon sa mga miyembro ng mga younger members of the tribe the stories of their nation. Kaya nga na-develop yung iba-ibang uri ng literature. Yung mga tula, poetry, kanta, Yan, dinadaan nila sa ganyang paraan yung pagka-transmit ng kanilang culture. Kaya nga, pag tayo ay, when we deal with the oral literature, oral communication, we should always learn how to read in between the lines. That's why it's better to discover the inner meaning of the story rather than focus on the literal means of the transmission of the story. So yan ang ibig sabihin ng oral communication. And when speech developed into language, the Homo sapiens had developed a medium that would set them apart from every other species and allow them to cover and conquer the world. That's why yung tao, nag-spread siya sa buong mundo because of language. Yung mga hayop, wala silang ganyang, they do not have that kind of ability which humans possess. Na itong means of communication ito ang naging dahilan kung bakit tayo ay naka-spread out around the world. Okay. Then after, sabi dito, language help humans move, but it also helped them to settle down. So language stored and transmitted important cultural information across time as one generation passed on its knowledge to the next, leading to the creation of villages and towns. And language also led to markets, the trade of goods and services, and eventually into cross-continental trade routes, and organized permanent trading centers grew, giving rise to cities, so etc. Then the second, after the development of the oral language or oral speech, na-invento din yung tinatawag natin na the script. So nagsimula na yung mga taong mag-devise ng mga symbols in order to put them in writing to symbolize the communication. So some histories of media technology skip this stage or give it a brief mention as a transition between the oral cultures and the cultures of the printing press. But the era was crucial for globalization and media. Language was essential but imperfect, and distance causes trouble for oral communication. So ito ang dahilan kung bakit na-imbento ang pagsusulat. Sapagkat ang oral medium ay hindi siya perpekto. So pwede siyang halimbawa ikinuwento mo siya sa isa, pag ikinuwento naman ng isa yung kwento mo doon sa isa, nababago yung kwento, either na nadadagdagan or nababawasan. And sometimes also there are also certain ambiguities with the use of language. That's why they develop the script in order to be able to give a correct and exact transmission of the oral communication. Okay. Now, writing has its own evolution and developed from the cave paintings, petroglyphs, and hieroglyphs. So there were many types of writing. Yung iba, meron silang sophisticated form of writing. Yung iba naman ay, yung writing nila was derived from calligraphy, from hieroglyphics, yung mga pictures, di ba? Ganun. And then, so early writing systems began to appear as early as 3000 BCE. With symbols carved into clay tablets to keep account of trade. And these cuneiform marks later developed into symbols that represented the syllables of the languages and eventually led to the creation of the alphabet, the scripted letters that present the smallest sound of language. And these alphabets, learned now in preschool around the world, were central to the evolution of humankind and its civilization. So, sabi dito, writing was done at first as carving into wood, clay, bronze, bones, stones, and even tortoise shell. These codes could then be spread over large distances and handed down through time. And the great civilization from Egypt, the Greece to Rome and China were made possible through the script. And if globalization is considered the economic, global, and political integration of the world, then surely script, the written word, must be considered an essential medium. So napaka-importante po ng development ng script sapagkat dito nagsimula na maitago ng mga tao at ma-store nila yung kanilang messages, that even if they are already dead or gone, or maybe the generation has gone, they were able to transmit to the next generation the knowledge and the information that they want to impart to the next generation. Then the third stage in the development of the media was the development of the printing press. Yung pag-develop ng printing press came later. It came later. Later na siya dumating. It came during the early part of the modern history. That was in the 15th century. And the very first book that was printed was the Holy Bible, of course, because people at the time were Christians, and then in Europe, most of the people in Europe then at the time were Christians, and the Bible was their favorite, favorite book, yan to say. And but later on, eventually, as the printing progress, especially the technology, um, nag-increase na rin yung mga pamamaraan ng ng mga klase ng mga books na napiprint nila. And nung unang panahon, ang ginagamit nila yung ano lang, yung mga parang hindi pa siya sophisticated ang mga printing press noon kaysa panahon natin ngayon. Noon gumagawa sila ng mga templates. Parang print, ini-imprint. Yan. So, yan ang kaganapan ng unang panahon. Now, the next development in the media is the development of the electronic media. And the beginning of the 19th century, a host of new media would revolutionize the ongoing process of globalization. And scholars have come to call this electronic media because they require electromagnetic energy, like, for example, electricity, the use of electricity, and also with this invention of electricity came the use of the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, the film, and the television. And in fact, one of the most revolutionary in mass communication actually is the invention of the radio. And in fact, the Italian inventor Marconi built or invented the radio. And eventually, as it goes on, you have the television, and you also have the other form of electronic media, like, for example, the telegram, for example, the use of the transmission of Morse code and through electromagnetic system, and which can be transmitted around the world or in distant places. So in our modern world, the telegraph is not thought of as a revolutionary medium. But in its time, the telegraph was a sensation with significant consequences. Samuel F.B. Morse began to work on a machine in the 1830s that eventually could send coded messages, dots and dashes, over electrical lines. Kaya maybe if you have already heard about the Morse code, it was Samuel Morse that invented the Morse code because he also invented the telegraph. And almost immediately, rail travel was also more efficient and safe since information about arrivals or delays could be passed down the line ahead of the trains. And corporations and businesses were able to exchange information about markets and prices. And newspapers could report information spontaneously by 1866. So after the development of the electronic media, then came the digital media. So dumating na yung tinatawag natin na digital media. So you have the predominance of the radio, the TV, and the computer. So digital media are most often electronic media that rely on digital codes, the long arcane combinations of zeros and ones that represents information. Many of our earlier media, such as the phones and television, can now be considered digital. Indeed, digital may even be blurring the lines among the media. If you can watch television, if you can take photographs, show movies, and send email on your smartphone or tablet, what does that mean for our neat categorization of media into television, film, or phone? So the computer, though it is the usual representation of the digital media, the computer comes as the latest and some would argue most significant medium to influence globalization. So eventually, the peak of the digital media is the computer that we have. Kaya nga minsan baga nakikita ninyo the analog television, the radio that we had before, kumbaga na over ano na siya, uh, natalo na siya ng computer. Kaya nga yung mga radio station ngayon, aside from the radio station, gumagamit na rin sila ng live sa social media, di ba? So that they can have the global reach because nga of this digital communication. And this is one of the most important uh, breaking invention of man, which is the computer, because the computer has revolutionized our information and technology system. So yan po ang that's the evolution of the mass media. Now, going to the earlier questions that I gave you, is globalization possible without the media? And I think you know the answer. You know the answer because without globalization, without the mass media, without the media, there will be no globalization. Okay, so let's take a look at some important aspects of that will answer this question. Like, for example, the global imagery or the global imaginary and the global village. The first person to use the term global village was McLuhan. So si McLuhan ang nag-introduce ng term na global village. As we have seen, one of the most important consequences of communication media for globalization has been through media, the people of the world came to know of the world. And that is, people have needed to be able to truly imagine the world and imagine themselves acting in the world for globalizations to proceed. So in other words, nagkaroon tayo ng idea about the world because of the media. And because of that knowledge, we were able to imagine ourselves as belonging to the world. That kahit hindi natin nakita yung ibang parts ng world, sa isip natin, nagkaroon tayo ng imagination, nagkaroon tayo ng, we were able to synthesize the idea that we are part of the world. And that kind of thinking, that kind of way of thinking in the world becomes the platform for globalization and for the development of ideas that spur or contributed to the growth of globalization. Now, political scientist Benedict Anderson added much to understanding of the global imaginary. So Anderson's primary focus was the origin of nations and nationalism. And he wondered how a group of people, though spread across vast expanses of land, came to conceive themselves as a nation. So Anderson's answer, the imagination. Okay. So para kay Anderson, paano naisip ng mga tao na sila ay isang bansa despite of the fact that there are hundreds of them, thousands of them, or millions of them spread across a vast land? Paano nang, halimbawa, from point A to point C, paano nila nasabi na we belong to one nation? How will the people of China were able to say that they were Chinese? How will the people of Japan say they were Japanese? When in fact there were many people residing in Japan, pero they were able to identify themselves as Japanese singularly. Sabi ni Anderson, the answer of Anderson is because of imagination. Because the people were able to imagine themselves as one. They were able to imagine themselves as people. Why? Because of the information that they get or receive from the media. Okay. Ngayon, as Arjun Apoddarai has argued, the imagination is not a trifling fantasy, but a social fact and the staging ground for action. Katulad sinasabi ko kanina. So the Irish people starving from the potato famine in the 1800s imagine a better life in America. And millions actually immigrated because of that. The Egyptian people suffering under a dictatorship imagine a better life for themselves. And that's why they fill the Tahrir Square in Cairo in order to overthrow a dictator and realize their own imagination. Okay. So the global imagery surely seems like a modern notion. But in the 1960s, media scholar Marshall McLuhan anticipated this phenomenon with his argument that media has connected the world in the ways that create a global village. So in other words, the global media has connected the world in such a way that we become now a global village. Ano ang ibig sabihin ng global village? Imagination ng global village. Ibig sabihin ng global village ay we became close to each other. The space that we thought was so vast and unreachable is now reachable. We know each other now because of the mass media. And the world has become smaller and smaller until we become a village. Okay. So, ultimately, however, globalization and media are producing the macabre marriage of the vision of Mumford and McLuhan. As McLuhan predicted, the media and globalization have connected the world and its people from end to end, that we can indeed imagine the world as a village. However, the connection or the closeness and interdependence of the global village has brought no collective harmony or peace. Instead, globalization and media are combining to create the dark, dystopian world that Mumford dreaded. They do so in three areas: economic, political, and cultural. So ito nga, kay McLuhan, sabi ni McLuhan, because of the mass media, nagkaroon tayo ng global village. We became closer to each other. But this closeness, according to Mumford, did not assure peace and security. The next thing that we have to consider is media and economic globalization. So the media has been essential to the growth of economic globalization in our world. And indeed, the media have made economic globalization possible by creating conditions for global capitalism. And because of this mass media, it has helped establish the global market. And at the same time, it also created an atmosphere of consumerism. So the role of the media in this process cannot be overstated. As a media scholar, Robert McChesney reminds us, economic and cultural globalization arguably would be impossible without global commercial media system to promote global markets and to encourage consumer values. Okay. So let us go to the media and the political globalization. So an essential process of globalization is the political. Globalization has transformed the world politics in profound ways. It led to the formation and then the overthrow of kingdoms and empires, and it led to the creation of the nation states. And now some argue that the nation state is being weakened as people and borders become ever more fluid in our globalized world. Some NGO argued that transnational political actors from the NGO, like the Greenpeace to corporations to the United Nations, now rise in prominence in our age of globalization. When we add the media to the admixture of globalization and politics, we touch upon some key important features of modern life. Okay, so ngayon, let's go to proceed to the other aspects of globalization. Then we also have the media and the cultural globalization. Okay, so the media on the level are the primary carriers of culture through the newspapers, the magazines, the movies, advertisement, televisions, the radio, the internet. We see the cultural products being promoted, and there is some sort of growing cultural imperialism or hegemony by other powerful nations or powerful states where they try to promote their culture through the mass media. So in some ways, these interactions are like cultural laboratory experiments. They sometimes result in startling and stunning hybrid creations. But in other times, they result in combustible and explosive mixture. many scholars have considered the various outcomes that can come from the commingling of media, cultural, and globalization. In his wise book, Globalization and Culture, Global Melange, Jean Navardine Pietris argues that there are actually three and only three outcomes with which to consider the influence of globalization on culture. Okay, cultural differentialism suggests that cultures are different, strong, and resilient. Distinctive cultures will endure. This outcome suggests despite globalization and the global reach of America or Western cultural forms. For some, this outcome is ominous for our era of globalization. It can suggest that cultures are destined to a clash of globalization. And this is specifically elucidated in the work of Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilization and the Remaking of the World Order. Now, cultural convergence suggests, ito yung pangalawa, cultural convergence suggests that globalization will bring about a growing sameness of culture. Ito naman yung isang theory. Sabi ng isang theory, ang globalization daw, because of the media, will come into a cultural convergence. Magkakaroon tayo ng unification of all our culture. Then, third is cultural hybridity. Suggests that globalization will bring about an increasing blending or the mixture of culture. So ito yung sinasabi kanina na according to Jean Navardine Vietzi, there are three outcomes of globalization on culture. Number one, you have the cultural differentialism. Then you have the cultural convergence and the cultural hybridity. So pag sinabi natin cultural differentialism, sinasuggest niya dito na some cultures are strong enough and they will resist change. That's why there will be a clash of civilization. While the other one, on the opposite side, the cultural convergence, sabi nila magkakaroon daw ng unification of culture. While yung pangatlong position is that there will be a cultural hybridity or a mixture of a different culture. Okay. So the three outcomes do a splendid job of organizing what could be thousands of distinct examples of the meetings of global and local culture. And there are many ways by which we can understand these three positions. Then let's talk about the dark contours of the global village. So globalization and media have done wondrous deeds. They have succeeded in bringing the world closer together. They have removed the shackles of time and space, and they have given us the ability to truly imagine the world as a global village. When McLuhan first conceived the term, he had the highest hopes, and even today, the term global village still evokes community, kinship, cooperation, and fraternity. But Louis Mumford was not fooled. His cold, clear vision of human weakness saw emergence of the dark contours of the global village. And he saw media technology used to better the world, but to exploit the world in pursuit of property, profit, and power. Our discussion here shows globalization and media too often have fulfilled Mumford's worst fear. They have built a village with large tracts of economic injustice, political repression, and cultural conflict. They have sown the seeds of bitter and deadly discord between nations, classes, political parties, ethnic groups, religion, and neighbors. They have pit humans against nature. They have spoiled the very globe they encircle, and we should expect better. So, we are guided by three questions. Has McLuhan's ideal of global village become a reality? Naging reality ba ang global village ni McLuhan? So the answer will depend on you. So probably yes, probably no, or probably yes, but it has a different magkaiba-iba yung kanyang contours. It has become a global village for the better. It also has become a global village for something else. Then the second question is, To what extent do global media serve as guardians of free speech, democracy, and justice? So to what extent do global media serve as guardians of free speech, democracy, and justice? And number three, what is the message of the new social media? What is the message of the new social media? So these are the things that needs an answer, and we hope that we can find this answer. You can find the right answers in the examination that I'm going to give to you. So thank you, my friends, for listening, and I hope that to see you again in the next discussions.